Yeah, good morning, everyone.
Good
Am I
morning, sir.
audible now?
Yes,
Good morning, Malpani sir.
Yeah, good morning. So we are at an interesting topic now in diabetic retinopathy, which is a very practical topic and of great importance to everyone, retina surgeon as well as general ophthalmologist. So I think we'll be starting since we are in time. I invite Dr. Chetra to speak on OCTA in diabetic macular edema.
Thank you, Moss, for this opportunity. Pleasure to be here. I will start off with my presentation, and also thank you for letting me speak first. I have another meeting. Right. Is my presentation visible?
Yes, Chaitra, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. So my topic is basically on Octa biomarkers in DME. I will be covering that, and just a slide or two on OCT as well, because I think we use it a little bit more often. So why is it important? Why are we treating diabetic macular edema? It's the most common cause of blindness in people in the productive age group now. That's very alarming and worrying. It can develop in both type 1 and type 2 diabetics, and about 8 to 13% of the diabetic patients develop DME with vision impairment at some time in their disease course. So the DME prevalence after 15 years of diabetes was 20% in patients with type 1, 25 in type 2 diabetes taking insulin, and 15% of patients in type 2 diabetes not taking insulin. So this is, significant numbers. This is an old study, but I'm sure the percentage is even more now because our population with diabetes itself has increased. So initially, we relied basically on fundus photography, clinical examination, where we classified into mild, moderate, and severe DME. And then we had the ETDRS, classification, where we looked at clinically significant macular edema. Then we have the angiography itself and the OCT, where we looked at the microaneurysms, the patterns of hyperfluorescence. We look at the macular ischemia using these two. So why do we need a biomarker? Because there are no methods to prospectively determine which patient will gain or lose vision. We don't have anything like that. We can't look at an OCT and we can't tell a patient that you're going to need 10 injections, you're going to need 5, you're going to need laser, you're going to need injection. How do we tell them? Because that's the first question. A patient walks into the OPD, sees their OCT, knows that they have a problem. The first question, how many injections will I need? So we need to individualize the risk assessment based on whatever we are able to examine and image. We need something that's non-invasive, that's readily obtainable, because a lot of them are expensive, they are time consuming, the patient needs to come again and again. And therefore, these imaging biomarkers can help at least personalize treatment based on what patterns they have. So this is the SDOCT we're all used to looking at, on a day-to-day basis for our patients with DME as well. We look at the retinal structural alterations. The ultrastructural is now visible with high resolution. We're even able to see the choroidal changes and correlate it with the macular abnormalities. We're able to look at vitreomacular interface changes so that we can plan treatment, surgical or medical. So just to cover OCT biomarkers that predict visual outcome, you have to look at the parallelism, the presence of SRF, the ISOS continuity, the EZ, the ID, the HRF, or the hyperreflective foci again helps us in plan which treatment we want to give. Looking at an attached vitreoretinal interface, hyperreflective material and where it is located, whether, within the cyst itself also can denote not a great prognosis. And what is the configuration of the intraretinal cystic space? Now, going on to Octa, which is the topic for the day, we know this is how the patients, So looking at diabetic retinopathy without edema, this is imaged even before any edema develops. The FAZ is already altered before we are able to see any clinical changes. Okay, so this is another patient where you can see superficial plexus and the deep plexus, where we are able to very well correlate the FAZ. You're able to see the microaneurysms. Forget the NVD. Just looking at the configuration itself, we are able to correlate the FAZ changes along with the angiography. I'm just showing you some clinical examples so that we can see how well we can correlate. Now, this is a paper that we published in IOVS special issue of 2016, where we looked at how the progression occurs across mild, moderate, severe, and PDR. So you can see the dropout areas. We used our own software to analyze. You can see the vascular density decreasing. You can see the increase in the areas where there is non-perfusion as the severity of the disease progresses. Macular ischemia on FA and OCTA also has shown a very, very good correlation. It is easier to perform the OCTA. It takes lesser time, time-wise, I would say. Of course, the image quality depends on the media, depends on the patient cooperation. The most challenging thing about OCTA is when you have to do the segmentation manually to get a little more information than that is given automated. So between the images of the angiography and the OCTA here again, you can see very, very good correlation between the FAZ borders. Now, again, here another patient where you can see increased FAZ capillary rarefaction, as I mentioned before, and you can see more microaneurysms in the DCP than in the SCP. So diabetic retinopathy with macular edema, sometimes the images, are not really very great. You can see an altered FAZ in both the superficial and the deep capillary plexus. The corresponding en-face, we tend to ignore the en-face, also shows well-demarcated zones of edema, which are correlating along with our SCOCT. This is again a patient with diabetic retinopathy and macular edema. I just showed you the well-demarcated zone of edema. Now, with response to treatment, where between good response and poor response DME, you can see more microaneurysms. You can see a larger foveal avascular zone and lower vascular flow density. So these are some things that we need to see. And they are particularly seen when there is a poor response to DME. This is again well delineated on OCTA. There's also good correlation between the OPL and the DCP that you can see, when you're using both imaging devices. A disrupted OPL and DCP non-flow areas actually correlate. Intraretinal cyst communication between the inner and outer nuclear layers also correspond to non-flow areas on DCP. So now going on to the superficial and deep summated plexus, the greatest absolute difference in the FAZ area between the visits was seen in the deep plexus using both automated and manual methods. So this is something which shows that the automated may also be quite reliable. So what are the difficulties on OCTA and DME? Differentiation and segmentation, like I mentioned, is difficult. Projection artifacts are there, especially when you have hard exudates, when you have dense hemorrhages, it is difficult. There could be misleading features on OCTA when there is edema and hard exudates due to these artifacts. So to conclude, prospectively, they help us determine which individuals will respond to the available treatment. They assist therapeutic selection and reduce the impact of invasive and burdensome treatment for our patients. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chaitra. That was excellent talk. That gives us overview of OCTA in DME. This is a new modality which has come in and not yet well known to a lot of people. So as more and more acceptance develops, like with OCT, we'll get to learn more about it. And there's an excellent overview of the OCTA in DME. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manish. Thanks for the opportunity. I request to be please excused. I have another meeting on site going on.
So we understand. We understand. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Bhaskar.
Thank you, madam.
Yeah.
Now the next.
Over to Dr. Sasode. Nice, sir. You please take over, sir.
You will be moderating. I will be presenting.
Yeah, no, go ahead, sir. I think tumcha's pehla talk hai, so please go ahead with your talk on multimodal imaging in DME.
Yes. I'm sharing my screen. Is it visible now? Yes.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for giving me the opportunity to speak on this topic. As Chaitra has elaborately given the importance of diabetic macular edema in cases, we know that this is the most mysterious conditions because of few facts about the diabetic macular edema, which one should know, because this is a chronic and progressive disorder, more prevalent than fractional detachment as well as vitreous hemorrhage. There is a loss of quality of vision and difficulty to manage the diabetic macular edema is the most challenging, and it is always, most of the time, it is refractory and causes a frustration to the patient and surgeon also, because these cases occurs in a very executive type of people who wants to read and write and enjoy the life after retirement. The fact about the diabetic DME, the pathogenesis is not exactly known, but it is a response to the hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia, prolonged hyperglycemia, and years together hyperglycemia can cause a free radicals release, PKC, AGA, and which leads to hypoxia and ischemia. There is a state of inflammation and liberation of VEGF, and there is alteration in the vitreomacular interface also. So we know that diabetic macular edema is now said to be as a chronic inflammation, which induces the state of low-grade inflammation. There is a breakdown of blood-retinal barrier, capillary occlusion, and tissue ischemia. In response, there occurs the edema. And after invention of the OCT in our practice, altogether the management has been changed. The objective, and we know that the OCT measurement of more than 300 micron or visual acuity less than 6.9 is the main criteria nowadays to treat. And OCT guided treatment is the mainstay of treatment, which helps really in diagnosis as well as the treatment and follow-up cases. The goals of the treatment in the diabetic macular edema is to reduce the amount of macular edema, to reduce leakage on angiography, to reduce the thickening on OCT, and to improve or stabilize the existing vision. Apart from this local treatment, we should know that there should be a good glycemic control, good BP control, lipidemia, and kidney disorders also should be managed well. In diabetic macular edema treatment, why it is required multimodal? Because I say standard of care is a laser treatment. Still, we need a multimodal because substantial group of patients do not respond to the laser because of new insight in the pathogenesis. We know that the VEGFs and chronic state and various markers which have been liberated by biological inflammatory markers, the newer treatments has been coming. And we know that the one treatment is suitable for one patient, while the same treatment is contraindicated in other cases, like in VEGF is not relatively contraindicated after stroke or after myocardial infarction. And DRCR study has shown us the various results of the anti-VEGF treatment in first year, second year, and third year, and up to the 5 years. How many injections are required and what is the outcome? So we'll also see that. So various types of modalities available are either in the form of anti-VEGFs, ranibizumab, Avastin, and nowadays Peginex as well as Eylea. Then laser photocoagulation can be red, green, or yellow, or micropulse. Then another modality is steroids in the form of Ozurdex or intravitreal or subtenous. And then if it is last treatment is a surgery, if it is associated with ERM with the diabetic macular edema. We know that the ischemic maculopathy is one of the things. There can be a division of maculopathy can be divided as a ischemic maculopathy, then focal maculopathy, then mixed type of maculopathy or diffuse type of diabetic macular edema. If it is a focal maculopathy, we know that the focal is around an microaneurysm, and if you treat that microaneurysm with the laser, you get a good result. And here you can see that the good results after the laser. And but there are some limitations to this one. If the microaneurysms are very close to the fovea, or if they are in the papillomacular bundle, you can't do the heavy lasers in those cases. Then another modality and type of diabetic macular edema comes in a diffuse type of macular edema, which is invariably associated with the systemic uncontrol of the diabetes as well as hypertension, cholesteremia, as well as the renal diseases. In those situations, first you have to manage with the anti-VEGF and then do the laser. And again, you have to keep on giving the injections. Till you get the resolution, you give the anti-VEGF, and once it is there, then you can go for the combined treatment like anti-VEGF plus laser, or sometimes you have to add steroids also. And you can see the good results with the anti-VEGF pre and post treatment. You can see here also, you can see that the sponge edema has been reduced drastically within weeks after giving the anti-VEGF injections. This is a pre and post eccentric injection. But in one thing one should understand, over a period of time, if you are practicing as a retina person, the patient is loyal to you years together, and he is suffering from maculopathy or diabetic retinopathy, then it is your decision-making power or your assessment which gives you what to be used and when it is to be used, when to use laser, when to use anti-VEGF, and when to use steroids, or when to use combined therapy. These are also one of the pictures which is pre and post treatment or Accentrics. But if there is a ERM, you cannot give the get the good results after injections. If it is diabetic macular edema is associated with PDR, then the anti-VEGF is the first line of treatment. That is how it is a multimodal. If it is associated with renal retinopathy or hypertensive, then anti-VEGFs are the first line of treatment. Then newer insight, because of the inflammatory nature of the diabetic macular edema, the steroids have come into the pictures. And you know that there are various types of steroids and their relative potency. Here it is shown. The dexamethasone is 25 times relatively potent. And while the steroids, why steroids and what is the difference between anti-VEGF is that anti-VEGF will act only against the VEGF, while the steroids acts against many inflammatory markers, including the VEGF. That's why steroid has an upper hand. But there are side effects of steroids. This cannot be given in cases of relative indications, contraindications in glaucoma, as well as it can progress to the cataract. And in inflammatory doubtful infection, it cannot be given. If it is a SMD, or in case there is intraretinal hyperreflective spot that shows that it is a inflammatory type of disease or diabetic macular edema, then Ozurdex gives you the good results. And this is also pre-Ozurdex and post-Ozurdex. This is another picture of pre and post. If a patient is not affordable, you can give the anti-IVT also. And in cases particularly post-op, you have to think of pseudophakic macular edema also. And this is a post-Accentrics, and this is a case of post-Ozurdex. If there is a ERMs and there is a cystoid macular edema with traction on this one, then you have to think of the surgeries. And then in cases, whatever you give, anti-VEGF, steroids or whatever, the rebound edema is a rule. And that is depending upon what type of edema you are dealing with. Particularly if it is a diffuse type of edema, systemic control matters more. So rebound edema is to be kept and periodic follow-up is required. In certain cases where there are hard exudate crystal beneath the macula, no treatment works. In such cases also, most of the times all treatments have been done, but because of uncontrolled systemic conditions, the treatment is failed. There are certain cases with like a mixed type of maculopathy. In those cases, you can try each and everything and keep on trying, and one fine day you may get a good result. So in conclusion, it is a diabetic macular edema is non-preventable, or there is no complete cure so far. Focus should be on early detection and treatment so that the patient's vision can be at least stabilized. Good communication, all concerned healthcare persons is very important, that include the ophthalmologist as well as diabetologist, to understand the physical and psychological stress of visual loss of because of diabetic macular edema should be understood, because there is a fear and anger on the part of patient because he is taking several times treatments in all forms, but the vision is not improving. So it is your wise and judicious selection of available modality and suitable combination can save the patient's vision and get the good results. Thank you very much. Thank you, Manish.
Thank you, Dr. Sasode sir, for your excellent talk as usual. It gives overview of not just medical side, but the practical side of diabetic macular edema, which we all know is can be such a frustrating disease to treat. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Anupam Malpani sir to talk about, give his talk on anti-VEGF in diabetic macular edema. Dr. Malpani sir, over to you.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Yeah, at the outset, I'd like to thank the scientific committee of MOS for giving me this opportunity today. So after an excellent overview by Dr. Manoj, I'll be speaking on the specific of role of anti-VEGFs in diabetic macular edema management. I have no financial disclosure to make. So we know that laser is the gold standard in treatment of diabetic retinopathy, and ETDRS way back in 1985 had shown that when focal laser is done for DME, it doubled the chances that the patient would not experience significant loss of vision as compared to observation. However, it also showed that only less than 3% gained 15 letters at 3 years, indicating that the laser in DME probably only helped to maintain the vision, but did not give improvement in vision. Also, it cannot be used in leaks within 500 micron of fovea. So because of these drawbacks, in 1990s, there was a surge of interest in angiogenesis research in ophthalmology. And this was one of the earliest publications showing the role of vascular endothelial growth factor in diabetic retinopathy. At present, we are well aware that VEGF-A is responsible for angiogenesis and vascular permeability, and this forms the rationale for the anti-VEGF treatment. These are some of the common anti-VEGF agents in clinical practice that we use routinely for treatment of various vascular diseases. So there's a wealth of level 1 evidence supporting the efficacy of anti-VEGF treatment in diabetic macular edema. You can see a long list of trials, phase 3 trials, some of which have been extended to 5 years or more. And all of them have shown that anti-VEGF agents give a clear benefit as compared to observation, laser, or even steroid in the form of triamcinolone. And these trials have been done in various combinations and different ethnic populations, showing good results. Now, Protocol I was one of the earliest trials done by DRCR-NET, and it to see various treatment modalities in diabetic macular edema, and it has shown that those patients in ranibizumab group had the best visual outcome as compared to laser or triamcinolone. And it was also seen that in the ranibizumab group itself, those patients who were treated with laser at a later date, that is deferred laser group, had a better outcome as compared to the prompt laser group. Another interesting thing noted was that the need for injection reduced over a period of time from an average of 8 to 9 injection in year 1 to almost 0 in year 4 and 0 in year 5. Similar results were also seen with aflibercept. But in aflibercept, another interesting thing seen was that a significant more number of patients had more than 2-step improvement in diabetic retinopathy severity score as compared to laser, indicating that probably anti-VEGF could also alter or reverse the changes of diabetic retinopathy. And this has been studied in Protocol W of DRCR-NET. Let us look at a clinical example. Now, this patient had come with bad diabetic macular edema, poor vision of 636 N18, received 1 injection of ranibizumab, had improvement in vision and decreased edema. And after 2 injections of ranibizumab, you can see the normal foveal contour and improvement in vision to 6/9 and 6 part, indicating that the anti-VEGF works not only in trials, but also in real world situations, as we have all experienced. So we'll try to answer some important and practical questions in the use of anti-VEGF in DME with the help of the various trial results. So first important thing is when to treat the patient. In non-center involving DME, we all know that laser is the best modality of treatment, and it's a no-brainer. But with center involving DME, laser cannot be done. So here we can divide the patient into 2 subgroups, those with good vision, that is 20/25 or better, and those with moderate to severe vision loss. And Protocol V of DRCR-NET tried to answer this question of use of anti-VEGF in those with good vision. They divided the patients into 3 subgroups. 1 received anti-VEGF, the second received laser, and the third was treated with observation only and no treatment. So it was seen that at 2 years, the patients with more than 5 letter loss was same in all the 3 subgroups. At the same time, at 2 years, those patients who had more than 5 letters gain also were same in all 3 subgroups, indicating that among the eyes with center involving DME and good vision, there is no significant difference in loss of vision at 2 years, whether they will manage with an anti-VEGF in the form of aflibercept, laser, or with observation, and recommended giving anti-VEGF only if the vision worsened. But we all know that various trials have shown that those with moderate to severe vision loss or with moderate to severe macular edema, they do very well with anti-VEGF agents. And in these patients, anti-VEGF agents are recommended. The second thing is to remember is one should treat early, because the trials have shown that if patient in laser group are in the patient in laser group, whenever they are shifted to ranibizumab treatment at 12 months, they will show improvement in vision over a period of time. And at 24 months, you can see there's hardly any difference between the treatment arm and the crossover arm, Whereas in Rise and Ride trial, when the same thing was done, but at a gap of 24 months instead of 12 months, the sham treated group had improvement in vision, but there was a significant difference between the crossover group and the treatment arm, indicating that probably delay was responsible for poor visual outcome. Now, important question of which anti-VEGF is preferable was tried to be answered by protocol T of DRCR-NET. Here, the patients were randomized to 3 groups. One received bevacizumab, second aflibercept, and third ranibizumab. And it was seen that at 2 years, the number of patients having improvement vision was almost same in aflibercept and ranibizumab group, but was a little less in bevacizumab group. However, when a subgroup analysis was done, it was found that those patients with poor vision, that is 20/50 or less, in them aflibercept gave a much better result as compared to ranibizumab, and bevacizumab had the least improvement. But when the patient's vision was relatively good between 20/30 to 20/40, all these injections, they had almost equal effect, and any of them can be used. Now, how to initiate the treatment and for how long? This question was tried to be answered by Luminous study, which showed that when patients were given a loading dose of 3 injections at monthly interval, then the patient with those group of patients in the loading dose group had a better visual gain as compared to those without loading dose, although the number of injections in both the groups were same. So it is recommended that one should give at least 3 to 6 injections, but one can defer injection if vision is 20/20 or better and OCT is normal, or visual acuity and OCT is stable for 2 consecutive injections. Now, important thing is how frequently to give. Now, we know that probably monthly injection would give the best outcome. However, this is not practically possible because of the cost and the treatment burden. The other option is a PRN, which again has a lot of visits. So one can try to use a treat and extend method, which combines the benefit of both and individualize the treatment on patient's need. Here, the treatment is initiated at monthly interval, maximum vision is achieved and no sign of disease activity. When the treatment is then extended and the patients are called at around 1 to 4 weeks and treatment is given till there is a recurrence. So the RETAIN study have shown that the visual outcome with treat and extend is almost same at 12 months and also at 24 months if you compare with the PRN treatment group. However, the number of visits were reduced by almost 40% with the treat and extend regime, reducing the treatment burden on the patient. So to summarize, currently anti-VEGF is the first line of treatment in center involving DME. Observation only is recommended if vision is very good, that is 20/25 or better. All anti-VEGF agents work equally well, except when vision is 20/50 or less, where probably aflibercept has an upper hand. Injection should be given early and in sufficient numbers. This is very important. A need for injection decreases over time, and individualized treatment in the form of treat and extend may be preferable. Thank you for kind attention.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Thank you for excellent talk of anti-VEGF. It's a pretty daunting task to trying to figure out how many injections would patient need, and frankly, we still cannot do it. But we give studies which are extending over 5 years give us broad guidelines which we can tell the patient that this is how the treatment might pan out. Thank you, Dr. Malpani, for excellent presentation. Next is Dr. Amruta Kumbhar. She will be talking about diabetic vitrectomies. She is vitreoretina consultant at JJ Group of Hospitals. Dr. Amruta is there?
Yes, sir. Good morning to all colleagues and seniors.
Malpani, sir, please close your...
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. It's not showing here.
So you have to stop screen share.
Yeah, but I'm not getting that stop share.
Because it is full of loaded with so many studies.
Try and minimize your presentation so you might get it.
Yeah, I've done that also. Maybe I'll log out and then log in again.
Okay, sir.
One second, just give me one.
Yes.
Is it
Amruta,
visible,
you can
sir?
share it. Yes,
Yes.
it is visible.
Good morning to all the colleagues and seniors, and thank you MOS for the opportunity. So today's topic is vitrectomy principles in PDR cases. So, diabetic retinopathy is the leading cause of irreversible blindness. Pathophysiologically, there is an interaction between various angiogenic and pro-inflammatory mediators such as vascular endothelial growth factors, which leads to fibrovascular growth. If this is not controlled, it leads to further complications such as vitreous hemorrhage, fractional retinal detachments, combined RDs, membrane formations, and vitreomacular tractions. So here are some of the PDR cases: preretinal hemorrhages, NVEs, traction with FBPs. Now, indications for vitrectomy in PDR: it is non-clearing vitreous hemorrhage, subhyaloid premacular hemorrhage, tractional defects such as TRDs threatening macula, combined rhegmatogenous and tractional RD, progressive FVP despite of adequate laser, epiretinal membranes with vitreomacular traction, and complications of previous vitrectomy surgeries. Now, objectives of vitrectomy are removal of axial opacities, relieve the anteroposterior and tangential traction, segmentation or peeling of the epiretinal membranes, affecting the hemostasis, closure of all the breaks, 360 degrees endo laser, tamponade if necessary, and managing the complications. Now, vitrectomy procedures is a surgery to remove all the vitreous from the eye. Microincisional vitrectomy surgeries are nowadays preferred, which uses the small probes such as 25 or 27 gauge probes with transconjunctival sclerotomies. The advantages of small probes is good dissection of the membranes with less or minimal trauma to the retinal tissue, self-healing sclerotomies, and less post-operative inflammation. 25 gauge combines the benefits of both 25 and 27 gauge. There are the infusion cannulas which are shown, which are used to maintain the globe during the surgeries. Now, illumination systems which are used are two types. First is 3 ports vitrectomy, which uses a standard endo illuminator. 4 ports vitrectomy or the bimanual approach to dissect the membranes. It uses the 25 gauge microfiber filament, which is also known as chandelier, which is shown in the picture. There are a few instruments which are used for the membrane peeling and cutting of the adherent membranes, such as ILM or ERM removal forceps, vertical scissors, diamond dusted membrane scraper to removal of the PVD, then extended endo laser probes. Dyes which can be used are triamcinolone acetonide for vitreous staining, which also acts as an anti-inflammatory mediator, brilliant blue dye for staining of the ILM. Tamponade, it is used whenever necessary. It is used in cases of revitrectomy, vitreous lavage, recurrent vitreous hemorrhage, combined RDs, and iatrogenic retinal breaks. Tamponade used is air, 14% C3 effect, and silicone oil. Now, vitrectomy procedure, there are two types. If PVD is present, the opening is made in the posterior hyaloid, and subhyaloid blood is aspirated with the help of cutter or the silicone tape cannula, is shown in the picture. But in some cases of the TRDs or the excessive fibrovascular traction, PVD induction should be avoided. Specifically, when the tractional membranes are at the posterior pole, do not induce any PVD. Create an opening in the posterior hyaloid face in a circular fashion, and then address the membranes. Membrane removal strategies are 3 types: segmentation, which cuts the bridging tissue between the foci of fibrovascular adhesion; delamination, connection between the posterior hyaloid membrane and ILM is cut; en bloc dissection, removal of vitreous and membrane as a single unit. Here are some pictures which shows the segmentation, delamination, and en bloc dissection. Whatever the fibrovascular tissue which is firmly adherent to the disc, it is reduced with the help of vitreous cutter, and small amount can be left at the disc. Then in combined detachments, where there is a SRF with rhegmatogenous and tractional detachment, start the dissection distant from the detached retina. Preparation of the tissue from the center to periphery is advisable. Perfluorocarbons can be used to stabilize the posterior retina. Peripheral retinectomies are needed for resurgeries and where the anterior fibrovascular proliferation has developed. Some of the complications post-vitrectomy are post-op vitreous hemorrhage, which is the most common complication, NVI and NVG development, cataract, fibrinoid syndrome, anterior hyaloid fibrovascular proliferation. Post-operative vitreous hemorrhage is a common complication. Early is within 4 weeks and late is after 4 weeks. So how to prevent this? Careful dissection of the fibrovascular membrane with the full hemostasis with endocautery during the surgery. Intraocular tamponade with C3F8 or silicone oil in recurrent cases. Preoperative intravitreal anti-VEGF for fluid in neovascularization and membranes. If it clears spontaneously, then most of the cases it clears spontaneously in less than 6 weeks. If it does not clear in more than 6 weeks, vitreous lavage with tamponade is recommended. Fibrinoid syndrome, breakdown of blood retina barrier with release of fibrin, which causes TRDs, pupillary block, ciliary body detachment, hypertony, and NVG. Treatment for this is topical steroids, PST, TPA injection in anterior chamber, revitrectomy with tamponade. Anterior hyaloid fibrovascular proliferation, which develops at the vitreous base, anterior retina, ciliary body, lens capsule, iris, with NVI, NVG, and TRDs. Treatment for this is lensectomy, cataract extraction, anterior dissection with retinectomy whenever necessary, extensive cryopexy or laser, and preoperative anti-VEGFs are helpful in some of the cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amruta. That was a very nice talk about principles of diabetic vitrectomy. Now, we can, do we have Dr. Supriya here? Dr. Supriya will be talking about diabetic vitrectomies and sharing her experience about it. She is a consultant head of department of vitreoretina at Dr. Mohan Rajan's eye clinic and VHS at Chennai. She is from Mumbai and ex Aditya Jyot fellow and consultant. Dr. Supriya, over to you, please. Can you?
Thank you, Dr. Bapai. And I'd like to begin with thanking all the MOS scientific committee for kindly remembering me during MOSCON and letting me be a part of the panel. Dr. Amruta has made my talk very easy because she's dealt with all the theory of vitrectomy for diabetic retinopathy. So I'm going to begin it's a video presentation. It's a video presentation, so just surgical videos. So this is a 23 gauge vitrectomy, and as Amruta said, don't try and induce a quick PED. Do it in a graded manner and try and lift, make a cleavage around the disc and the retina with your cutter or a forceps, and do it in a graded manner. So this is the cutter being used to elevate the posterior hyaloid from its attachment to the disc. Luckily, it's not very vascular. As you can see, a lot of the retinal photocoagulation scars in the periphery. So that has made it relatively avascular. And then you can deal with the areas of focal points of traction where the hyaloid is adherent. Once the disc and macula is clear, then you can go on and trim the other FPPs. In the second case, it's a much vascular disease as you can see. And here we are raising the hyaloid with the cutter itself. This is the rollback technique where the hyaloid itself, the vitreous itself falls back, the membranes fall into the retina. With the cutter itself from the disc, we are using it for traction, and then with forceps, we are able to elevate it. So it's a combination of delamination and segmentation. This is en bloc resection. We are removing the whole membrane, and it's a dynamic state where we are using the bits and parts of all the theories. Cautery is being done to attain avascular, to attain hemostasis. This is another place where we are using a cutter itself. The cutter itself is going between the posterior hyaloid and the retina, and as a blunt dissection, it's going ahead, and because the cutter tip is, the port is much closer to the tip, and hence it makes it much easier for us to introduce the cutter below the membranes. Also, because of the beveled edges that we're getting in the cutters nowadays, the high cutting rates also make sure there's no traction on the retina. So we can also do something called a hybrid vitrectomy where we are using 23 in some bits and 25 in some bits. Here you can see some segmentation being done. And you can see a large vessel there which is going to bleed, and now we're doing cautery to that blood vessel and trying and achieving hemostasis there. So again, the cutter is being used as the main instrument. This is another case where we are trying to delineate it from the disc and try and form cleavage points here. And sorry, that's me overseeing the sun there. And so the cutter and the forceps are able to, if it's closer to the disc, we can do a posterior to anterior delamination. As you go to the periphery, sometimes the membranes become more taut. So here the forceps is being used to elevate it, and then with the cutter we are able to go beneath the membranes and towards the retina and then segment it. So achieving hemostasis is very important. You can see the bleed on the side there. So you can either increase the bottle height or increase the intraocular pressure. Sometimes, as Amrita said, PFCL can also be used, but it's important to keep an eye on that intraocular pressure, because in these diabetics already the optic nerve is quite compromised. So you don't want to go ahead with a well-attached retina but a pale disc at the end of surgery. Sometimes it makes sense to leave some tips of not go ahead and relieve the entire traction, but leave some amount of the fibrous tissue, because that also acts as a tamponade on the vascular bleeds. This is a patient who had a very thick fibrovascular membrane with a CRD, and we're trying to use a cutter, but then realized bimanual dissection is a much better option. So chandelier has been introduced that leaves both your hands free, one to lift the membranes and then the cutter to go ahead and cut it. So it's important to realize early on in the surgery when bimanual dissection would be a good option and to go ahead with it. So that gives you ample time. Otherwise, by the time you realize it's a complicated surgery, it would help to have both the hands free. You may be a little later on in the surgery with corneal edema. So choosing it earlier on helps. And now the rest of the membranes are being dealt with in the usual manner. So here you can see the cutter comfortably going below the membranes and dissecting. So this is where we're trying to lift. So sometimes it looks very tough, but as you can see, the membrane comes off very easily. It may be just a very loose adherence in the posterior pole. So we're clearing that and then going on anteriorly. So here also the retina is not very sticky. I mean, it is sticky, but it's not tightly adherent. And so we're able to lift the entire hyaloid and go ahead with the cutting. Here the vitreous is rolling back again into the cutter tip. And sometimes it's okay to have some minimal bleeds during surgery and not cauterize every bleed that you see. This is a patient who had dense astroid hyalosis with PRD in the background. So, in astroid hyalosis also the vitreous is very sticky and adherent. So that makes your surgery doubly complicated. And here you can see the cutter nibbling. So the high cutting speeds have decreased the sphere of influence, allows us to go very close to the retina. We're having 10,000 cutting rates, 25 gauge, 23 gauge. So 23 is a good balance between 25 and 20, which is more rigid, helps us to go to the peripheries more easily. But as I said, we can always do a hybrid vitrectomy. You prefer a 25 gauge cautery, 25 gauge laser, sometimes even 25 gauge instruments like a cutter or a forceps. You can do that in a 23 gauge vitrectomy session also. So that's mostly what I do nowadays. And here you can see the cutter very nicely nibbling away. It's important to realize when to stop and to see the points of attachment here. So this is when I used the OCT, intraoperative OCT, microscopic integrated OCT, which helps identify the cleavages very nicely. That's the shadow of the cutter that you see here. So better instruments are being formed here, and that helps in a good dissection. So as Dr. Amruta said, I'll just stop share. As Dr. Amruta said, doing a good, every vitreoretinal surgeon can be a champ in diabetic retinopathy. So the points are to do a good core vitrectomy, which is the C. H is hyaloid dissection. A is anti-VEGF preoperatively. M is the membrane dissection, and P is a good pan-retinal photocoagulation. As you could see, most of the surgery which I had done had a good PRP done pre-operatively. So that helps to prevent intraoperative bleeds, or decrease it, not prevent, maybe decrease it, or iatrogenic breaks intraoperatively. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Supriya. That was a wonderful talk. I think we are quite in time. If there are any points of discussion, we can take, have a couple of points. Dr. Sasavade sir, Dr. Malpani sir, can you share your experience about diabetic vitrectomies and tips for this?
I think Supriya has done a very good job. She's shown excellent videos. But I feel that diabetic vitrectomy is probably the only place where a 27 gauge cutter has a very great role to play. It gives a lot of, you don't need any other instrument if you're using 27 gauge with a beveled tip, because you can go under the membranes easily, you can cut everything. So that is the only place where I feel that 27 gauge has an important role to play and gives a very good result. So most of the bimanual things you can now do unimanually with 27 gauge. I don't know what is others' experience about.
Dr. Sasavade sir?
Yeah, 27 I have used previously as a wonderful experience in the care cases, particularly these types of advanced PDRs. You don't require forceps or seizures, but the only problem in India comes that you cannot use it for multiple cases. One case is, or maximum 2 cases you can do, or even I have seen in a single case also it starts reducing functioning at the end of the surgery. So 27, even though it is a good, practically it makes problem. So in macular hole and all those things, it can work. But in PDR, where the lots of vitrectomy and membrane cutting is required, I think 25 is the best in between the 27 and 23 gauge. And 25 works very well with the 10,000 cutters and bevel tip, which is very close to the opening is very close to the end of the cutter, and it gives good dissection. Over a period of time, we have stopped using scissors at all. Scissor is not used since so many years. Sometimes you require forceps, but the scissor is out of our armamentarium because of these good cutters.
Dr. Supriya, there is a question for you from Dr. Amruta as to when would you recommend doing ILM peeling?
So I don't do a routine ILM peeling in all vitrectomy cases, because we know that the macula is already ischemic, and going ahead and trying to peel the ILM sometimes can complicate things. So definitely if there is DME, then I would consider peeling off the ILM and leaving a bit of tricot at the end of surgery, but not as a routine. Sometimes during SOR also you can decide to do an ILM peeling if there is DME. Yeah, but I don't do it routinely for all patients.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Dr. Ajay wants to say something here.
Yeah. So I think Supriya, it was lovely videos which I liked of yours. I just have one caveat which I use in all my PDR cases, even blindly. So when you have these extensive fibrovascular proliferations around the disc and the arcades, I prefer always to start the dissection from the disc, or around the disc region. As you rightly said, the retina is thicker there, and you can get a very good cleavage plane. So as Anupam was saying, using these fine cutters, if you can get that correct plane, which you get always around the disc, so I always initiate my dissection. I call it as disc onward dissection in PDR. Just wanted to share this one point, which I usually do in all my cases, and makes it very easy to progress from center to the periphery. Makes the case very easy. Thanks.
That's true. But sometimes you have maybe subhyaloid hemorrhage. You have a hyaloid which is already elevated anteriorly. So it's good to start anterior to posterior, and then you concentrate on your FVP
Yeah.
at risk.
True. I think each
So
case is
I've
individual.
learned never to say never in diabetes. It's
True,
so
true.
dynamic, and you just decide intraoperatively. But as you said, it's always preferable to start posterior to anterior. Yes, sir.
Great. Great. Yeah.
Supriya, your cases were very advanced PDR cases. You might have given the anti-VEGF before surgery.
We do
Yes.
give so anti-VEGF as a routine. I give it if it's quite vascular, then I prefer giving 3 to 4 days pre-operatively. And somehow I found that during COVID, a lot of them younger diabetics, somehow that aggressive diabetic retinopathies progressed, and they're all coming in really advanced stages also. So those cases which we used to get earlier with just one FVP somewhere or just one focal attachment, I'm not seeing them anywhere anymore. So
Lot of
Have you
combined
seen-
RDs are also coming now.
Yes, yes.
yes,
Have
absolutely.
you seen that if patient has taken anti-VEGF and because of some reason, maybe because he has not got the fitness or some other reasons, he has not come with the, as Manish said, come with the combined RDs later on after
Yes,
15
so I
days or
give
20.
anti-VEGF only after patient has received his fitness. I don't inject
Yeah,
before
that's true.
doing fitness. Getting
And then
fitness.
don't check sugar again pre-operation.
Yeah, yeah, I know. It would be out of control, and then you
Yeah.
are scared to go.
Yes.
Anyway,
yes,
I
that's
think
some-
that was a great session we had.
Yes.
We had a wonderful talks about imaging of diabetic macular edema by Dr. Chaitra and Dr. Manoj Sasode sir. Then it was followed by in detail a description about role of anti-VEGF in management of DME, and it was very lucidly presented by Dr. Malpani sir. Dr. Amruta spoke about principles of vitrectomy in diabetes, and then it was followed by bouquet of excellent surgical videos by Dr. Supriya. I think it covers diabetic retinopathy in very comprehensively, and this was a wonderful session. Thank you all the speakers for joining and contributing for this session. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I think.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone,
Thank you.
particularly the MOS Scientific Committee and all participants for attending this useful session. Thank you very much. Thank you, Supriya.